Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, or good day, wherever you may be in the world. This is Thursdays. Must be Thursdays with Thomas on IDAGIO.com, the place where classical music happens. And my goodness, Thursdays is becoming quite the happening place for me. I am having such fun meeting new people, reconnecting with colleagues, exploring different dimensions of our industry. And I'm getting some wonderful feedback from you all out there that you're enjoying these programs and it's enlightening and it's entertaining and sometimes funny. And I appreciate the feedback. So go ahead and keep it going. If you don't want to be nice, then don't be. It's okay. We're having a great time. And tonight we're going to have some more great time. We have some wonderful things to announce. And it's my pleasure, a colleague that I've obviously known about and maybe you've known about, but never met personally. And here we are in our Zoom universe. Timothy Patrick McAllister, known as Timothy McAllister, the distinguished, I'll tell you why I said that later, it's a joke, the distinguished saxophonist and professor at the University of Michigan, soloist extraordinaire on an instrument we don't always necessarily in the classical medium think of as a solo instrument, but we're going to talk about that. It's a pleasure to have you on, Tim. It's great to meet you. And, welcome. You're in Michigan, right?
I'm in Ann Arbor, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It's just such a pleasure to join one of my heroes and someone.
Oh, get out of here.
Seriously, and we haven't had a chance to meet, and to meet like this is quite an honor, and I really appreciate the support.
Oh, come, it's our honor. It's fantastic. And we're going to talk about the quartet and the program you lead. But I must say, I mean, I know your name, obviously, but I hadn't really, kind of dug into who you are and all the many records that you and all the many achievements and unbelievable associations with some of the greatest composers of our time. I mean, do you pinch yourself sometimes?
Absolutely, I try to. It is cliche and hyperbole and all of that to say, one is living their dream, and I truly believe that I am, and it's allowed me to interface with some of our greatest conductors, performers, soloists,
Yeah.
Composers, and it really is. It's been a labor of love, but it's also been
Yeah.
it's been an arc. It's been an arc that I think I dreamed about very young, so yeah.
Well,
Absolutely.
tell me about that. Where do you come from? Where did all this? Where did your life and music? Is your folk music? Did you grow up in a saxophone quartet, or where did it all start? How did you become Tim?
Well, I think when we talk about just the important role of music education and instrumental music training in the U.S., it also for so many of us it started in the school band. And for me, growing up as a child of the 80s, really, I mean, I was born in the 70s, but grew up in the 80s where we saw this whole just explosion of media culture with
Right.
MTV and pop music. It seems like every pop song had a saxophone solo. It was on every movie soundtrack. I think for a lot of us, when we were choosing our school instruments, the most popular instruments were drums, trumpet, saxophone, right?
Right.
And I grew up in Houston, Texas, actually,
Ah.
literally in the shadow of the backyard of the Johnson Space Center. So
Wow.
my mother was an aerospace engineer. She worked for NASA and Mission Control. She knew all the astronauts. I grew up knowing the astronauts. We were a very privileged community, a very affluent community. We had a fantastic school system, and we had an incredible, legendary school concert band program
Wow.
that had this great feeder system coming out of the junior high program. And I started playing music in my life was always in the home, and my mother grew up as a violist and a pianist, but she had this really interesting life. She went into public school teaching, but then she kind of found her way through engineering and mathematics. She found her way into aerospace engineering, but she always wanted me to be a musician, and I started taking piano lessons with her in the home. But I gravitated to the saxophone. I wasn't one of these people that may started on another instrument and then chose saxophone, or doubled on multiple instruments and then specialized, moved to saxophone as a specialist. It
Right.
was something where I chose it from the very beginning. And the band program allowed for that, of course. And you know, it was shiny. It was shiny. It was fun, and it was also quite visible in popular culture. But what I found about the band program, the school band program, was that I fell in love with classical based music. I fell in love with concert music, and saxophone the concert band, the role of the symphonic band is a safe place to call ourselves classical players.
Right.
So, but from there, I mean, I started slowly discovering this kind of underworld, if you will, of the non-mainstream classical world that involves all of these instruments you don't think of as the typical soloist instruments. But I discovered a lot of amazing repertoire, and then 1987, I went to go hear the Houston Grand Opera premiere this amazing opera by this man named John Adams, who we didn't know anything about.
Wow.
And we knew he was the name of a president, but I got to hear the premiere of Nixon in China in Houston.
Oh my.
And my private saxophone teacher was playing the first book for the soprano saxophone part in the orchestra, and it blew me away. I mean, it literally changed my life, because I did attend symphony concerts. I loved band. I loved classical saxophone. I did play jazz too and all of that. But it was that spectacle of Nixon in China that almost single-handedly guided my life, because I looked at that and I saw just the relevance of my instrument. There were 4 saxophones in that orchestration, as you're aware of, and hearing new music on this scale, contemporary music on this scale in which my instrument was relevant. I pointed my ship, as you will, to that star, and I said, that's what I want.
Wow.
So I think it really, early on, all the way through high school, I had a sense that there was a path for this, and really it was in academia, and of course that's where I reside, and so many of us reside that would call ourselves classical players.
Right.
But I wanted to go to college. I wanted to be a music major in saxophone and follow that world.
Do you have siblings? Are they musical?
I have an older sister. She's 8 years older than me, and then I have a younger brother who's 5 years younger than me. And both of them were involved in music, but they didn't pursue that professionally.
But they must be fascinated with your life.
Yeah, they're still in Texas, and my mother still lives in Houston, and my father, when I was very young, remarried, and he lives out in Arizona. So, for me, like I feel really disconnected from my family, but now, of course, more and more, with this kind of technology, we're more in touch.
I mean, that is one, out of crises comes opportunity, and certainly the general recognition across the world of all public that there is a digital universe that enhances real life is probably a positive development. It is also this singular lifeline to classical music at the moment.
Yeah.
A singular lifeline, I should say. And actually, apropos, going right to the Idagio equation, IDAGIO.com was a very forward-thinking company with its first streaming platform, which was an amazing project that started some 2 years ago in 2004. And I've been with him since the beginning until Jan Sokovic had his big, his mission was actually artistic. I want to get public and artists together. I want to have them closer together. They don't need a company. They want to hear the music. They want to know where their artists or their music is that they can hear wherever they are, whenever they are. And to foresightfully see that the streaming platforms are going to be so powerful, I think was very smart. So that's the rock, that's the bedrock of Idagio. And then last spring, when COVID hit, and everybody was saying, how can we keep people's minds together? How can we keep them connected to things they're passionate about? And the IDAGIO.com equation was pretty self-understood. We need to go quicker than we had thought we would to video, and in fact, live video. And that's where Idagio Live was born. And a couple of us signed up and said, of course, let's do something. I'll talk about song. We can interview people. We can see colleagues, let's make it a community. And we had some wonderful colleagues giving, lectures on Mahler and, Ivan Fischer and Kirill Gerstein doing fantastic work on Bach. And, it's been a wonderful experiment. And then it went to the next dimension in June, which was very exciting, called Global Concert Hall. And the Global Concert Hall was literally creating a digital world in which digital analog music presentation could be curated. And that, I think, was also very foresightful. And a lot of institutions are doing that now. Everybody's sort of trying to put things up on streaming and so forth. But the mandate with IDAGIO, with the Global Concert Hall, was let's get the presenters in. You film it. You make your concert. We'll put up a paywall, which was also, I think, a timely response to. I mean, we love to give things away and be generous, but in fact, people who love classical music also want to they know when they buy a ticket, they're participating to something that supports the effort, the extraordinary abilities of artists. It's perfectly natural to buy a ticket to something. And so having a paywall that actually says, okay, not only is it a paywall, but an extraordinary generous part, 70 to 80% of anything's generated from this paywall goes straight to the artists. And I think this had a real resonance, and we kicked that off, and it's been, kind of don't look back now. And every organization is coming in and doing partnership. And the equation is a live concert. Some can be pre-produced and then played. There's always a digital green room after the concert event. The concert lives for a limited amount of time online, which is defined by the artists involved. If it's up to IDAGIO, we say 24 hours, maybe 36 hours, and it goes away. We're not building a catalog. We're providing a platform. And I think that's very exciting. And then why you and I are talking is because somewhere in the summer, I was just, all spring actually, and I have a lot of young singers in my stead. I don't have a studio, and I don't belong to any one particular institution, although I'm very proud of my association with the University of Michigan and Manhattan School of Music as guest artist. But the point is, you don't become a musician if you can't play. And you don't certainly become a singer unless you put your stuff on the line and actually have to sing and memorize. I thought we've got to create platforms for young people. And quite frankly, also this pandemic, I found myself saying, and I don't mean to hold such a speech here, but jump in at any time you want to, but I found myself saying to some of my students as I was doing something on Zoom and curating some conversation about repertoire and what do we do now. I'm not convinced. I mean, it's gotten better. You can actually teach some singing on some level in a digital platform, especially if you know the singers, but that's another conversation. But I found myself saying to the kids, young colleagues, and I really see them as that, whatever you thought your life was going to be in December 2019, it isn't that. No. It just isn't that. And I think that's a message we as educators have to be very honest with our younger colleagues that, and it's not just being adaptable and pivot. There are new lives and consciousness, a new now, and this is the most demonstrable new now we've had in decades. But that link of development, that sense of total insecurity, can I become a professional musician? I think should not be underestimated in the younger community. And that's why I thought, come on, let's if we've got this platform and it works, I mean, what the hell? I'll pay for it. Let's put up a platform. We'll put up a theater. We'll have the kids come sing, dance, whatever they're going to do. Then I talked to Tilda about it, and then I actually talked to a school about it, because the first people that did this Arts at Future was Karlsruhe. And it was because they were having their October festival and they were doing a Wolfram Riem class, which is all avant-garde music. I don't know if he's written anything for the saxophone. But anyway, and the first thing the professor said to me, he says, well, it's a lovely idea, but I think our students would be nervous about being on a platform where major professional singers or artists are showing up. And I said, you're absolutely right. It should be its own series, focused on and known whoever is on it and buys a ticket for it. Arts at Future is about young artists. And give them a break, give them a support, listen to them. What you're doing by tuning in is letting these kids be the musicians they have been training for and dreaming to be on a professional level so far their whole lives. And so I partnered with, I do the heavy lifting and the contacts and the people I know and so forth, and then we turn it over and IDAGIO turns it in. And most organizations are doing online stuff anyway. So it's just a matter of helping them flip the switch. And so we're going to have your fantastic and very famous saxophone class now do what would have been a online in your community, now an international event. And that's why we're talking, because I think it's just one of the most exciting developments of all this innovating inside of what should have been a oh my God period. It's still an oh my God period, but look what we can do. So I promise I won't talk so much again, ladies and gentlemen. I want Tim to tell us our story, but here we go. Tell us about the concert. What's going to happen?
Well, I mean, first off, thank you for all of your vision and just your commitment to this international community through this platform. It's stunning. And when I first heard about it, when I was approached by our associate dean, Mark Clegg,
right,
I was so honored that he thought of my studio, my program, my class. He thought of them first. He could have gone, first of all, within our school, there's so much parity amongst all these studios and how fantastic the programs all of my amazing colleagues lead, that it could have gone.
It's an amazing school.
Well, it could have gone to any one of our programs, of course. But I think Mark wanted this to be an opportunity for maybe an underserved platform, an underserved studio in this case, on a mainstream level. But really, there's beautiful history with my program. I'm fortunate and honored to be only the third professor in the history of the program to steward the saxophone studio. My predecessor was Donald Cinta, who taught. He was my teacher. I studied at Michigan, and he taught at Michigan for 40 years.
Oh my.
And he retired in 2014 and still lives in Ann Arbor and still practices 3 hours a day. The man is still an inspiration at 82 plus years old. And his predecessor was quite literally the first saxophone professor in the United States, and a gentleman named Larry Teal, who was the first, really I should clarify that, the first tenure track professor of saxophone for a specialized program in saxophone training. And he started that in 1953. And it was just grew out of the great American band movement and the rise of collegiate bands. So the legendary conductor in Michigan, William D. Ravelli, he insisted that there would be specialists teaching every instrument. And he had to have, in his mind, the best band program in the land. So he wanted the best in the region to teach saxophone. So Larry Teal was a major figure in the Detroit scene.
Yeah,
he taught so many incredible players, jazz and classical, and he played in all of the dance bands, house bands, vaudeville, everything. But he got the call. He was the person to be appointed to that. But so really, I look at our whole program as honoring his vision, both Ravelli's and the dean at the time, who Ravelli had to convince to hire a professor of saxophone. And for a long time, Dean Earl V. Moore wouldn't do it, but William D. Ravelli would leave records of the great French virtuoso Marcel Mule. He would leave them outside his office door every single day until he would finally answer his request. And so there was just this kind of,
I love it.
Die-hard need in his mind to have an expert teaching that instrument. But before that, in the United States, you had many music schools where saxophone training was going on, but it was all kind of embedded in a woodwind program or a woodwind degree program. We had classical saxophone training going on at Juilliard in the 40s and 50s, but it was also kind of embedded as an extension of the clarinet program.
Right.
So. Anyway, I mean,
but it seems to me, I'm gonna wander out here a little bit, and that is that I think most people, even our classical community who loves this program and is listening, probably, I mean, when someone hears saxophone, the first thing they think it really is jazz.
Of course.
And they think of popular music. I think that I love you talking about this genealogy and the depth and the length and the repertoire. And of course, and I'm going to do a little screen sharing here in a bit and show people this massive discography you have and composers you've never heard of before and all of this kind of stuff. But the point is that there's kind of an untold history of classical saxophone. I mean, I know it only by accident, because I am one of the few people that ever sang the Hamlet by Ambroise Thomas, yes, who had a saxophone in the orchestration, as well as the Hérodiade of Massenet, which I think at that time the instrument was rather new, wasn't it? Wasn't it about
Yeah,
that time? How did it come to being? I mean, is a story like Wagner's trombone?
it's very similar, and Hamlet was I believe the first major example,
I
and
think so.
and then also Werther. So Werther has a famous saxophone solo throughout, and then you see its use even with Berg and in Lulu and
Right.
all that as it continues to move through. Uh, so even Puccini. I mean, Puccini uses as an obligato instrument, so
Right.
it doesn't always get recorded or performed that way, but it's there in Tosca
Right. I'll
and
be damned.
in
In
Turandot.
Tosca.
So it's obligato, So it just
Ah.
never found its way like in that regard. But also, I think there was always that it was always that the kind of stigma of finding an expert. And ultimately, I mean, we always like to say in our community that if Brahms was alive and heard what we're doing now with the instrument, he would have written for us. But
Yeah.
the players Brahms heard, if he heard it at all, and we believe he did, I don't think it would have inspired much confidence to write a piece for it. So, I mean, we've had to spend 200 years catching up in many ways and trying to justify its place in all of this. But
Well,
we do,
is it if you think about it, if it had come into the mainstream, and you think about the back row of woodwinds, and you've got your clarinets, you've got the B flat and E flat and A flat. If you've got all three of them there, you've got the oboe, the English horn, the bassoons, and then you would have a couple of different saxophones. The saxophone has such a unique color and power that seems to me that it would just kind of make the bassoon obsolete.
well, I mean, frankly, that was the inventor, the Adolf Sax. I mean, that was his plan all along.
Ah,
His plan was to improve essentially the deficiencies of the bassoon, contrabassoon, low reeds. I mean, he was responsible for the bass clarinet, for the modernized bass
I was
clarinet.
going to say, where does a bass clarinet come in? Yeah.
Well, that's his baby. So the bass clarinet community, all clarinet community, they owe a lot to Adolf Sax. So, but I mean, the original idea for the instrument was that it was a low instrument. So
Right.
some of the very first piece written for saxophone was by Hector Berlioz, and that's the inclusion of bass saxophone and a small chamber piece called Chant Sacré.
All right.
And Adolf Sax gave the premiere. He gave the premiere of the piece. And that was the first use. So the lowest
So
was where Sachs saw it being helpful because it was a more agile version of a more projecting quality that you would hear in the low reeds.
you think some of the resistance to the instrument, because it would require more new works to make it, new orchestral works to make it function, because there's no way you could just invite it to play along in Beethoven, Schubert, Mozart repertoire, or
Right.
even Weber.
Yeah,
It's not
well,
going to anything pre-sax is not going to happen.
right. And Adolf Sachs was this incredible like businessman essentially. He was just trying to build allies and people that would promote the instrument. He was trying to make a buck. We always joke about that. Maybe there was some kind of grand vision there, but in the end, he was just trying to make some money. And he wanted a more agile or more accessible version of a single reed low woodwind instrument. But it took off in the band world because King Louis Philippe in France mandated that all of the infantry bands would use Adolf Sax instruments. So that's where it found its home. But
Wow.
he developed a whole side family of instruments that were intended simply for the orchestra and simply for opera. And he had proponents. I mean, Meyerbeer spoke very, very positively of it. These figures of this time, a lot of major names that got lost in history a little bit. These kind of B-level operatic
Right. Right.
composers. They all said incredibly positive things. Rossini said very positive things about the saxophone. Berlioz loved it. So Sax, he also, while he was getting these kind of people to support him, he was also creating a lot of enemies in the process. So he was
Okay.
he was a very politically controversial figure. You had composers and instrument manufacturers that were fighting him. He was involved in lawsuits right up until his death, and he died impoverished.
Welcome to the world of art.
Yeah, I mean, but when we think about like the effort of that, like if someone tried to invent an instrument right now, and within 200 years it had this massive legacy, that would be pretty unrealistic, I think. And so, I mean, we've seen similar movements even in trying to incorporate something like the electric guitar into
Right.
classical mainstream. We've
Right.
seen that, you know, people, I mean, I think Kurt Weill tried to make banjo. I think Kurt Weill tried to make banjo part of like the classical mainstream. You
Right.
know, we've seen those efforts, and what Adolf Sax was able to achieve is shocking, really, because the instrument, what we may be interlopers in the classical community, but he created an instrument that literally became emblematic of an entire genre of music within 20 years of his death. You know, in jazz.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
mean, he created an instrument that became the flag
So
bearer.
how did flip? I can imagine that if there was some decree and saxophones and bands and marching, that probably was the death knell for the Mahlers and Strausses and Fitzners and Schrakers of the world to take the instrument necessarily quite seriously. I'm not trying to put
Oh, I think
words in these great meisters' mouth, but it kind of slid in that direction, and the sound then it got associated. How did the spin come into the popular idiom, or not even popular? How did it find itself in the jazz world?
I think it just became an extension of the woodwind doubler players, and ultimately you had clarinet players that were moving to the saxophone because it just projected a little bit better with
Yeah.
the evolving jazz band, you know, JASS, you know, the New Orleans Jazz Band, and then of course
Yeah.
Kansas City and Chicago, but the saxophone was just getting
By the way, it was called jazz because the word jazz was considered to be too vulgar.
right, exactly,
I love it.
and talk
Even
about
even Eubie Blake in some on some YouTube interview way back in the day said, "We didn't say jazz. That's a bad." You know, I'm not sure he ever used that word. I mean, it was considered a vulgar term, which I find fascinating.
Well, and you know, we also look at a major when we talk about, you know, experiences and gatekeepers and all of that. I mean, some of it has to do with the perception of an instrument. You know, whether it's a conductor or a composer or a you know someone hiring musicians. But when we want to talk about political movements, the saxophone was gaining amazing traction in Germany. So you want to
All right.
talk about Berlin, 1920, in
Yeah.
1930, saxophone was a fixture of the
Yeah.
Weimar Republic. You had saxophone as a fixture of Bauhaus music and Bauhaus, the movement of Bauhaus, and you have basically Hitler outlawing the instrument because the instrument was considered degenerate and was associated with black culture and
Wow.
Jewish musicians. And that was it. But up until then, you have Schoenberg, Weber, and Berg all writing for the instrument. You have Hindemith and Weil and well, the names just go on and on. Schulhoff, Erwin Schulhoff is one of my favorite
Yeah.
composers. You have the wonderful Victor Ullmann
Yeah.
opera, the Kaiser, and that has this amazing saxophone part that leads the
Kaiser
entire.
of Atlantis. Yeah.
Yes, that the saxophone part leads the entire opera.
Were
And
were that was that extraordinary community of immigrated geniuses in the 40s and 30s and 40s in California, like Talk and Casanova Tedesco, were they writing for the saxophone?
yes, yes.
Right.
and we can say
Wow.
and we can say that you know that's where some interesting intersections started to happen, you know, like with even composers that were immigrating, like Darius Milhaud and
Yeah.
all, and you know, of course Hindemith comes to New England, and all of his proteges. Bernard Haydn was a very famous protege. No one knows except in the saxophone world. We worship this man, but he passed in 2000. But Bernard Haydn was Hindemith's most famous pupil after Harold Gensmer. And Bernard Haydn sets up shop. Bernard Haydn sets up shop in Detroit, Michigan. He starts conducting a sort of a sort of B-level symphony orchestra in Detroit. But he ends up becoming a neighbor of Larry Teal, who I mentioned, and he writes our first major American saxophone sonata, written by Bernard Haydn. And then he goes off and becomes chair of composition at Indiana University, and where he forms you know, these relationships with the saxophone professor there for many years, and he has a massive catalog of saxophone pieces. So we trace so much of what we consider our most important repertoire. We're certainly tracing it to the immigrant, you know, composition of
Absolutely.
voices. Yeah, voices.
So was it what I mean, going back a little bit again, was it just the sound of it that just captured you as a kid? Was it just that's a cool thing? I mean, in full confession, before I answer that, I wanted to learn the saxophone, and in our school, it was a very humble private religious school in the Northwest, and it wasn't exclusive; it was just small, and it was a band culture, of course. And I had started on the cornet, and it was loud and fun and whatever. But I wanted there was a saxophone, and there were a couple of kids that played on it, but there was one mouthpiece.
Okay. Oh boy.
And I found the whole thing so disgusting. I just thought I just can't do that. I'm not going to do that. I mean, I wasn't prissy, but I just thought, everybody has a line they're not going to cross. So, and there was a kid in the community that could play really cool saxophone. I just thought it was the neatest thing that ever happened. But I never got there, unfortunately. Anyway, so that's my story. You unfortunately had a different turn. When was the first time did you have to go get the saxophone because you heard it and loved it, or you saw it, or how did it work? What happened?
Well, kind of referring to what I was saying earlier about the junior high band program,
Yeah.
like basically the junior high band directors would basically come to the schools like vendors and try to recruit students to come be in their band in 6th grade. So it was an instrument petting zoo, literally. So, I mean, I knew about the saxophone, but I mean, to actually hold one and look at it and just sort of, the keyboard and the tactile quality of it and all, I was so inspired to play.
But did you try out the clarinet and say, that doesn't feel right? Or
No,
did you ever think about the flute? Nah, I don't want to do that. Or the bassoon?
A funny story about that, which a lot of my students, I ended up telling this many times, is I probably owe my career to my mother because not because of just how she raised me, but because
we all owe our careers to our mothers. Move on.
But I was probably almost 6 feet tall by 5th grade. So,
oh my goodness!
I was very tall, very slender. I mean, I was, now I'm wider, but I was tiny and slender. But the band director at the 6th grade level said, we really need someone of your size to play tuba. So he said, and I said, but I'd like to play saxophone. It's like, no, we have too many people that already really want to sign up for saxophone.
Right.
We need tuba. I'm going to put you down for tuba. How about that? So he signed me down. He signed my form, and I went home, and I was suddenly a tuba player. And I went and told my mother, and she said, no way. She's like, if my son wants to play saxophone, he is going to get to play saxophone. So. So she called up the band director and said, nope, he wants to play saxophone. So, but it was there was a need for sort of physically capable players for the larger brass instruments. And of course,
as a junior high kid, I played tuba for 3 years.
Okay. Well,
yeah. There's 3 and 4. I played tuba and sousaphone, which is a little bit of a trick, I mean, my first Dvorak 9, was. I love it. That's so funny. I can imagine. I get the atmosphere totally. I love the petting zoo.
This is trivia for generations ahead about your life, that you're revealing here. But I mean, I saw saxophone particularly just like with figures like Clarence Clemens and Bruce Springsteen band and people like that were super inspiring to see on television. But I think when I first heard Charlie Parker, just my mother had some CDs of Charlie Parker. I mean, once I heard
seriously.
Yeah, I mean, my mother had an incredibly eclectic record and CD collection. CDs were new at the time; they were coming out little by little. But I mean, she had Tchaikovsky symphonies sitting right next to some, jazz CDs. But and then we had fusion and everything else. So I mean, we didn't really have pop music in the house, but we had kind of every form of classical through jazz. So I was just kind of hearing it omnivorously. I was hearing classical music and jazz as just coexisting exactly the same, and I could equally be inspired by famous violinists as much as I was hearing jazz saxophone players. So I mean, I don't know if it was the sound that inspired me. I think it was just that I took to the instrument and I saw it in a popular world, and I saw it also in the classical world.
And how is that? Has that been schizophrenic at times? Was it ever schizophrenic?
It was, because so much of us, I mean, I can safely say that I have a thriving career doing what I dream to do and I love, but I can't impose that upon students. I think we have to make sure that we give them a pretty rounded education so they have many different avenues to pursue.
Right.
But I walked the path of being pretty diverse in my skills up until probably 25 years old. So in high school I liked playing jazz just as much classical. In college I played jazz, but I was targeting the classical path. But what we've learned, and I think many people would back me up in this statement, we certainly have some outliers in this regard, but it is virtually impossible to achieve the highest standards, ideals of classical playing and jazz playing in the same person. I think.
Well, I'm curious about that because I mean, do you have that improvisatory ability, and do you play all the saxophones?
Yes, play all the saxophones. That would be expected of all of us by the time we reach professional level, because we've got to say yes to what the gig was going to be, and
tell us how many saxophones are there?
So the original family was 7,
Wow.
Well, I guess still to this day we see that. So the B flat E flat family, there was an F and C family that Sachs called the orchestral family, and there were some instruments built for that. Strauss wrote the Sinfonia Domestica for a quartet of F and C instruments, and then that all got reorchestrated for B flat and E flat instruments, which were the band family, which is what we are now. But that went from sopranino saxophone, which is about this big, all the way to the contrabass saxophone. The contrabasses exist, but they're still rare, and they're very expensive, and they're not necessarily called for. The bass saxophone is called for in Strauss's piece. So I personally own sopranino through bass. And so the sopranino, soprano, alto is the one you start on and is usually the most common. That's where the large amount of repertoire is. Tenor saxophone, baritone saxophone, bass saxophone, and then the contrabass saxophone. And then there's some really interesting innovators and instrument manufacturers like Eppelsheim, actually, in Germany, who's creating all these hybrid instruments. One is called the Tubax, which is like this it's basically a very accessible contrabass saxophone that's much more compact. He created something called the contraforte, which is a re-envisioning of the contrabassoon, and yet it really looks like a black baritone saxophone with a double reed on it. So there's there's still some things happening, and Thomas Addis writes for that instrument, by the way. So when we talk about invented instrument, the contraforte has literally infiltrated the contrabassoon world, and so some people have to really make a decision where their allegiances will lie. But,
with the span of instruments, does each one of them? Always the first thing is you're going to probably reading music in different clefs, which is probably a little bit technical for the audience we're listening to. But But is it a fundamentally different technique for each instrument?
Well, that's a great question, and that's actually a pretty common question, really. But so early on in the training of the instrument, it was expected you read all the clefs, tenor and alto, everything. And even what was the one in between? There was another clef. There was a strange clef that was in between, like tenor and baritone, maybe. But there was some, But now everyone reads, whether you're playing the smallest or the largest saxophone. We're reading everything at written pitch. So if we're reading everything at written pitch, we're all reading in treble clef. And so, but it's always sounding totally differently. So when you play a baritone and bass instrument, you're reading in the treble clef, but the sound is now, an octave and a half below what you're reading. So conductors get really frustrated about this because they'll be looking at a baritone sax part in the score, and if it's written at pitch, they have to do the transposition in their own heads if they want to address, where it sounds in the chord, for instance. So that's kind of frustrating. But yeah, the keyboard of the instrument is exactly the same. A C on one instrument is a C on the other instrument.
Oh, that helps.
But you're dealing with a wildly different ergonomic between the instruments.
Yeah, so, I can imagine that.
I mean, I have visual aids so I came prepared. So
here we go.
But here, this is a bass saxophone mouthpiece. Okay.
Right.
Bass saxophone mouthpiece. But here is a soprano saxophone mouthpiece.
Wow.
Okay, so, right. So the reeds are wildly different in size.
Yeah.
And the soprano mouthpiece requires so much more embouchure strength that you wouldn't start a young student on that instrument. And
Okay.
then conversely, I guess, or not conversely, really, the bass saxophone or baritone saxophone requires so much more air support that it becomes very
Yeah.
challenging. And the ergonomic of the instrument and the head and the weight of the instrument is so great
Yeah.
that you're not going
Yeah.
to start. You're not going to start an 11-year-old on that instrument.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the alto is the happy medium of all of it, and that's where we all really start. Um,
Now,
but by the time it,
the Scientology of reeds has changed significantly. Are you into the plastic world as well? I mean, they've become
uh,
quite amazing.
I'm impressed you know that. So that no, but
I'll
there,
tell you why. No, because one of my closest friends he was Ernst Ottenshammer,
oh,
the
okay,
principal clarinetist of Vienna, who
yeah.
died very tragically and suddenly and broke all of our hearts about 4 years ago.
Mhm.
And I'm very close friends with his boys, Daniel and Alexander, and they're both principals of Berlin and Vienna. So, yeah, I don't mean to be.
No, no,
I'm showing. I'm not showing off, but it
oh,
does
no.
in because there's still some of your colleagues that plastic, and they
It the innovations have been incredible in that world, and
yeah.
that all started about 20. Well, there have been the idea of synthetic reeds has gone all the way back to the 50s.
Okay.
There were so many kind of close achievements and accomplishments with those reads, where they were just coming close to making it into kind of a mainstream, but there would always be something about them. There was always some kind of design flaw. Even Don Cinta would talk about it. There was some plastic reeds he was endorsing at one point, but when you hit certain pitches on the instrument, it created a waveform that would snap the reed.
Oh my.
So yeah, so there was, and I think instrument makers really understood the nature of how cane vibrates even 300 years ago,
Wow.
in
Yeah.
a way that I think they knew that cane would have certain tolerances, for certain just frequencies, for instance, overblowing frequencies. But so in recent years, by 2020, now we're talking about some pretty impressive improvements in synthetic reeds, and it's found its way into the mainstream of clarinet, saxophone, and now we're even seeing it find its way into the double reed world.
Wow.
And they don't want to admit it, but they certainly love the convenience of it. And then
Yeah.
that's so I
And I
don't even
presume durability.
right. So
Yeah.
in many cases, the greatest success for me with synthetic reeds has happened in the lower instruments. So
Okay.
the tenor saxophone, the baritone saxophone, bass, those reeds are so much more vulnerable to drying out and warpage and wetness and humidity and all of that. And when you put a synthetic reed on, you can immediately play. And so then it's a matter of massaging and colorizing the sound without the worry of what the reed is doing to take away from that.
Right.
But I haven't found that. I personally don't use the plastic for the higher instruments, like
Right.
my main instruments, alto and
Okay,
soprano.
we're gonna back out of the weeds here
Sure, of
and
course,
go
I
back.
know.
And that's fantastic. And I love it. It fascinates me endlessly, and I can imagine the sound as well. And I can imagine it's probably easier on the. But never mind. What I wanted to ask you earlier was with this schizophrenia. What I meant by jazz and classical and your training and your love of music and so forth. I mean, are you one of those guys that, I mean, the whole jazz world is improvisation, is listening and going in the keys and just picking up and go. I mean, was that what you did in some quartets? Just sit in and go with that? I mean, was that your ability as well?
I got to that. I got to a certain point where I was fairly comfortable in that
Wow.
regard. I mean, or at least I wasn't embarrassing. But I also found that ultimately made me a better classical player.
Okay.
Because I was thinking I could think in multiple keys. I could sort of think in terms of like when it came down to really knowing my role in an orchestration to sit down. I mean, the biggest challenge we have as classical players when it comes to, for instance, the orchestral world, is we are the outsiders. We are plugged in by a personnel manager, and we may know nothing about the culture of that wind section, and we
Right.
have to sit in as an extra, an auxiliary player, and we have to quickly sit in and scan everything and have a sense of what is the dynamic of the wind sound of the wind family, what's going on with pitch, who's listening to whom, and where do we need to fit in that quickly, and then what are the characteristics that the conductor might want from us. When I've worked with Michael Tilson Thomas, he wants a very operatic saxophone approach. When I've worked with Riccardo Muti, Muti wants something much more subdued. He wants something that blends into that extension of the clarinet world, the clarinet section. They all have a different view of how that instrument should function. So going back to just sort of thinking in multiple keys and just sort of knowing all the instruments, it's helped me to just immediately be able to look at a score and have a sense of how I fit in every chord and how I need to fit in relation to my peers in the wind section. It's helped me navigate that world very, very well. And I also credit my music education training, because I was really old when I was a music major in school. I was really interested in two different paths, either K through 12 teaching, band training, band school teaching, or I had the fantasies of being a saxophone professor and a freelance performer. And I was getting a music education degree and a performance degree at the same time. And I tried to chart both paths simultaneously. And I took conducting very seriously. I was being recruited by the great Gustav Meyer at Michigan to be in his orchestral training, his orchestral conducting class.
Yeah.
That was Gustav was Marin's teacher, our wonderful friend Marin, and I had dreams of being a conductor too. So for me, I was just
Well, you still could.
well, of course, I guess, but I
mean,
think
do you conduct at all?
no, I have
You're too busy.
yeah, well, but I mean, there's been no invitations. I look at, I mean, but maybe someone listening would like to, no, but I've always had a little bit of jealousy when I watch Martin Frost, doing his thing, or I've seen, famous pianists who've had some stints as conductors, but it was. For me, it was like maybe 4 different hats I wanted to wear, and classical playing, just being functional as a jazz playing. I wanted to be a great teacher. I saw myself possibly being a school band director. I saw myself possibly being an orchestral conductor, and so I just kind of went every direction. And the fork in the road came when I was offered a couple of different jobs simultaneously, and one was saxophone professor at my very first job, which was SUNY Potsdam, up at Crane School of Music.
Wow.
Where Renee Fleming got, where she went, where she studied, and there were some famous singers that came out of there, Stephanie Blythe, that was my first saxophone teaching job, and I was 24 years old, and so I kind of at that moment it's like, well, there's where life took me, but I think all along I was thinking I'd be a conductor, so I'm kind of getting ahead of what I was trying to say. I think score study and studying conductors and my window into that world to sit and study Carlos Kleiber all day long and to just fall in love with this world, it just made me literally made me a better saxophone player. So I cherish that, and jazz is part of that too.
Yeah. Did you play ever with Carlos Kleiber?
No, that would have been a dream.
Oh,
But
man.
his repertoire was
I
so
was lucky. I got to sing with him a couple of times
I'm
and
sure.
around it. And I went to a lot of his concerts, and oh my God. I mean, I'm like you. I mean, I can lose a whole evening just going down the YouTube rabbit hole of rehearsals and performance of Carlos Kleiber. It's just unbelievable.
Well,
And to talk to colleagues in the Vienna Philharmonic, they all feel that way. It was just a dimension. I'm one of those thrilling things. There were no tickets left for the Rosenkavalier filming with him conducting and a wonderful cast, but we knew the guy who was the producer, and so he said, "Okay, look, I'm going to do so." And literally, my wife and I sat literally under camera 3 in the loge on Carlos Kleiber for Rosenkavalier. I mean, I couldn't speak for days. I mean, it was just, unbelievable.
So Gustav Meyer retired from University of Michigan, and I ended up studying my second master's degree was in conducting, but I studied the wind conducting round.
Okay.
And I studied with Bob Reynolds, who worshipped Carlos Kleiber.
I love this. He holds the Doctor of Musical Arts and other degrees in music education, conducting, and performance from the University of Michigan, where he studied saxophone with Donald Sinton. This is from your biography. And I just love this idea. Most people would just be really glad to have Doctor of Musical Arts on their biography. But there's this sort of, and other degrees. Would you like to list them?
Well, I think it was conducting, performance, music education, and that would be it. Yeah.
Masters?
Yeah,
That's
masters,
a
masters
that's a
in,
hell of a lot of work, Timothy.
well, there was two masters at the same time, masters in wind conducting and masters in saxophone performance. So,
Look, what I'm going to do, I don't want to miss opportunity. We're going to do some screen sharing here. I've got to punch a few buttons here, and I pulled up I pulled up the first thing we're going to see is one of your latest recordings,
oh, yeah.
which I didn't know, which I just, first of all, anything that's titled the fifth century, I'm going to have to drop my needle into it. But as you can see, I'm in my browser. I'm going to go first over here. This is your website. And ladies and gentlemen, I can't encourage you enough to write this man's name down and go read this biography, because probably there are going to be names of composers in there you've never heard of, and you can go back to idagio.com and say, well, what the hell does that guy do? And then it's going to be a lot of fun. But it is, it's a beautiful website. And I'm extremely interested in the John Corigliano piece. I know John quite well and admire him enormously, and have sung some of his music, not nearly enough. I took some notes from I started to take notes, and it just became ridiculous. So I thought I'd just show the website over here and say, you click over here, you can see you got a biography and recordings. His recordings is a wonderful listing of things and performances. And, your discography and your performance list is a who's who of 20th and 21st century musicians on both classical and jazz, but probably more heavily weighted in the classical, as you would expect. I also pulled up the Adagio. Here's your website, or your landing page. If you put in Timothy McAllister in here, you'll get coming. And this is really just a phenomenally interesting collection of music. And if you just scroll through here, this is your Grammy Award winner, right? The John Adams, City Noir. Should we just drop the needle on that a minute?
Sure.
I think just give, and what of these tracks would be a good, if we're gonna listen to a minute and a half of music. This isn't a radio show, folks. I'm really just teasing you, and have some fun. But I think the sound of what we're talking about would really. How about Boulevard Night?
Well, so Boulevard Night, that'd be so maybe something that you hear me right away. Let's do the second movement of the saxophone.
Okay.
So the molto vivo.
The song is for you?
No, the last track at the bottom.
Oh, I see. Also, Monte Vivo here.
Yep.
All right. And I promise you already, we're going to break off tragically, but let's have a listen. This will be wonderful. Oh my God. So when John said, I'm going to write you a saxophone concerto, and you were elated, of course, was this the second piece he wrote for you? Or did he write City Noir first?
So City Noir City Noir included me. I got the call to be part of this. So that's this huge 35-minute symphony with
Right.
this massive saxophone part that threads the whole piece, because
Right.
he saw the saxophone as really truly representing that film noir sound. But he wanted to write a virtuoso part that was, not for a doubler, he wanted it for a specialist. And very interestingly, even though it drew upon film noir sound and culture, when it came to trying to ask him, and this also came up with the saxophone concerto, the question was, what is the sound you're envisioning? And the sound he never really heard much of and didn't really care for was this mid-century Parisian Paris Conservatory saxophone 1950s sound, which had a lot of kind of cliche vibrato and playing a lot of this kind of lighter French music like Ibert and Bozza and all these names. But he didn't hear it that way. He saw the inspiration being from someone like Stan Getz and a famous album that he was involved in called Focus, which is with a string quintet, all these compositions for tenor sax solo and string quintet. That was the inspiration. But when it came to a piece like City Noir, it's like, well, do you want a jazz sound? And do you want me to sound like a jazz player? Do you want me to use a jazz setup, like a jazz mouthpiece? And the answer was always no. I want you to do what you do, and I'm writing for that. And ultimately, it created huge challenges because actually, in comparison, a jazz mouthpiece is actually literally much louder than a classical mouthpiece. A classical mouthpiece,
I'm sure.
A classical mouthpiece is designed to allow you to be able to subdue the instrument in many ways, to bring the sound in check and colorize it and match other woodwinds, for instance, in an orchestra. But when I started working on first rehearsal of City Noir with the LA Philharmonic, this was Dudamel's first week with LA, and LA is a big orchestra. They have the right budget for the right size of the orchestra, and he wrote this for a massive orchestra. You have 6 horns and 2 harps, and you have 4 trumpets, and anyway. But I asked him, "Can you hear me?" And he's like, "No, I can't hear you." And I'm like, I'm playing as loud as I can play, and I needed to cut through this thick, dense orchestration. But in short,
you sound like a singer.
Well, I thought about that often, but I thought, well, how do I project and maintain my sound and maintain the core of what I'm wanting, and how do I really? But it caused a pivot in my playing in order to sort of exist more in the symphonic world and with this music, even like a little bit with what you're hearing in the saxophone concerto. So John quite literally initiated for me a change in my approach to how I play the instrument, because I wanted to alter my equipment and my pedagogy to address exactly what you're talking about, what a singer deals with in the operatic world, projection without amplification. And I needed to be able to project over this massive orchestra from the position in the woodwind section. So, but I never resorted to moving to, for instance, a jazz.
But wouldn't a concerto, wouldn't you be up front?
Well, no, for the concerto. So the City Noir.
For the concerto, that was City Noir. Got it.
Yeah, for City Noir. For the concerto, I call the concerto like the son of City Noir, because it sort of draws on the similar things, but now you're out front, and it's a smaller. There's a smaller orchestra. It's a small orchestra with no percussion. So anyway, I mean, John literally and I crafted kind of a new approach, a hybrid sound that he deemed in his mind the new American sound, and that became something that kind of got touched upon by colleagues over in Europe even, and where it was a kind of a fusion of the French classical tradition and the jazz world. So you mentioned I have John to thank for that.
Well, we have John to thank for so much. I mean, talk about an American sound. I mean, good Lord. You mentioned Nixon in China. I'm going to do a new production of that in a couple of years, which I'm really looking forward to. And I mean, the Wound Dresser is just one of the most iconic pieces of American literature ever written. Absolutely. You mentioned Stan Getz. I'm going to go back into screen sharing and ask you a different question. While I'm doing that, is Stan Getz a hero?
Sure. Absolutely.
I mean, he's a hero to me. Yeah, and I don't even play the instrument. I mean, wasn't he just an amazing human being?
He was incredible. Yeah. I mean,
I want to go back. Timothy. Tell me where to go. I would love to play something a little more lyrical, just so somebody can
Oh, how
people
about
people
this?
respond to the absolute beauty of your playing. And
Well,
tell me where to go.
how about the second movement of the Konasan Concerto that I recorded with Stefan Deneve in the Brussels Philharmonic? So that
Okay,
it's right
where is that? Oh, here
yeah,
we go.
here to your right. The second movement of his saxophone concerto is called, it's a ballad, it's a ballade, and it's just beautiful. It's incredibly beautiful writing.
What is the first piece? What is this? Serafes and Kadat?
So
La
that
Cité de Soya Couchant. This sounds very Arabian.
Yeah, those are three. So that's the those. So those are Lovecraft, based on Lovecraft stories. So those are
Okay.
and then the concertos right there. Those next three tracks. So if you go to the second one, Ballade.
Yeah. We're going to go to the ballad. Again, please forgive me, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to listen to this, and if I have to break it, never mind, never mind. You get the drill. Oh, that hurts. Oh, that
Yeah.
hurts. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I want to show you something. When you're on the IDAGIO platform, this is really fantastic, and I
Yeah.
love this platform. If you go over, for instance, what we just were, if you go over here and you push this chevron, you actually get a bit more information, which is great.
Hmm.
And in some literature, like if you're looking at songs or other more known pieces, if you actually play it here from here, you'll get on the other side of the screen a listing of all the other performances of that piece in the database, which is great fun. But this is the fun bit here. So you go here and you add to a playlist. And
Hmm.
you can see I have a lot of playlists, and I'm going to create a playlist, and I'm going to call it, Tim the Great.
Yeah.
Right? And I'm going to create a playlist. And that instantly, I've done this right now, that is instantly available on my telephone, my iPad, my any other computer, whatever else. And this is streaming. So you're going to take this wherever you want to go. And I promise you, I'm going to be listening to this piece tonight while I'm packing up to go to the next place. It's so incredibly beautiful. But that's a little bit of how to use the IDAGIO platform, which is an awful lot of fun. I'm going to go to another window, which shows us the Global Concert Hall announcing on the 7th of December at 2 o'clock Central Eastern, but don't, that is Central European time, 2 o'clock in the morning. In other words, get up in the morning, it'll be there. It's going to be there for a couple of days. This is the University of Michigan Saxophone Studio Fall Quartet Showcase. And it's only €9.90, which gives you complete, and you'll hear everything. You want to check in on this. It's going to be a lot of fun. Look at this. This is what the program is. some friends of mine, people I love, Jennifer Higdon. She wrote a piece for me, which was very exciting. Anything else? Tell us something about this program and what we're going to hear.
Well, you said it earlier, just about the various silver linings of if we can find them in this COVID period. And one of the things that I think this platform has provided for us is a chance to share our work with the world. And we really, when we think about how we had to pivot at the university level, it shined a greater light on chamber music more so than at any other time in the history of academia, because the orchestra and the symphonic band and the opera programs, they were all just hindered by social distancing measures. And so, well, I told my class from day one, the very first day of school, and we're not gonna run with our tail between our legs. We're going to embrace this moment, and we're going to put all of our energy and efforts into into our bread and butter, which is saxophone quartet. I mean, yes, we have a safe place in the band world. Yes, we have a marginal element, a marginal identity in the orchestral world. But where we thrive is chamber music, and the saxophone quartet goes back earlier than any of the symphonic repertoire that included saxophone. And the earliest music for saxophone quartet starts in the 1850s.
Wow.
And by, of course, again, many names that have been lost in history, but we have, through the efforts of a group that I play in, for instance, like the Prism Saxophone Quartet.
Thank you for mentioning that.
Well, we've been together the group has been together for 36 years. I joined the group 20 years ago, and
are you the newbie?
well, yeah, we've had one younger since then, but there's been only a few personnel changes. We were the original group were all students at the University of Michigan. So saxophone quartet's been part of our identity for forever. But anyway,
and you mentioned the Prism. I didn't get to. I was looking at all the things we didn't get to, and one of them was the Prism Quartet. I mean, you have on a lot of recordings out there. You guys have been groundbreaking for composers, and it's just. I mean, you've been at the heartbeat of creative America for the last 30 years, and fantastic. God bless. It's unbelievable.
We our careers are what we make them, and it's the same thing. We have to tell students that there's nothing for any of us. I guess we really can't say there's anything waiting for us. We don't just get plugged. We just don't get plugged into a job. There's not a job fair. Where an engineering major might just walk right out of their bachelor's degree. Working at a company. We have to make our careers. And when we talk about the saxophone quartet as a medium, it is a self-made medium, and there are literally no composers of note that haven't written for the saxophone quartet at this point in time. And we are making sure that no one leaves this earth and passes on to the next dimension without writing for the saxophone or the saxophone quartet. And so my students see the saxophone quartet as their rallying cry within our program of where we really can make a difference. The portability, the mobility of making chamber music like this, and having four heads instead of one. A soloist is a lonely life. But a quartet, obviously, you're bringing the power of four minds together. And anyway, so you're going to hear. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No. What was the process of recording? Just to wrap this up, and I don't want to keep you all too long, but it's fantastic and interesting. How did it? Were you able in the same room?
Well, so we have five.
And you're in that. University of Michigan has a spectacular state-of-the-art recording setup. I mean,
yes. Well, we weren't able because COVID. So we had everything set up. There are 5 sax quartets in the program, and we were all set up to use what's called the Duderstadt Media Center across the street from the music school, which is this amazing soundstage.
Amazing.
And we were all set up to do it, and then COVID hit one of their staff members, and it shut everything down. So we had to quickly pivot to kind of moving this recital event that was to be simultaneously filmed. We moved it to another auditorium on campus right nearby called Stamps Auditorium. It's a beautiful space, and it's my favorite place to record. My most recent solo album came out of that hall. So we moved it to there, and it became our fall November recital. and it literally fell upon me to take care of all of it. So I mean, we're using my audio and video equipment,
Oh my goodness me.
and so it comes off. Well, I think, and I had some help with some final editing. I had enlisted some very gifted students to help me with some of the final video production, but it comes off, I think, highly professional, but it's really kind of self-made, and it's a message to my students that that's kind of an arena we have to become good at
Absolutely.
now too. I mean,
Absolutely.
we are now charging our students, and of course it brings up all kinds of topics about inequity, I guess, which is sad because some kids don't have that access, but that's a different show, I guess. But but we're saying now that in the 21st century, we're saying that we have to be good educators, we have to be good performers, we have to be to some degree musicologists and theorists, and now we also have to be engineers. We have to be audiovisual engineers, and we also need to understand the social media market.
Right.
But I think this is a perfect example of what we were able to do in this environment. And I believe it is some of the highest level playing in my career of students in my entire career. And you're going to hear five groups, and so we had to stagger, just because of room rest regulations and all of that. We had to stagger the performance so there was enough time between the groups. And it was there. These are performances, but they were multi-camera shoots. So we had 3 cameras, and nice microphones. And basically they had to kind of clear the space for the next group.
I have a performance myself, Munich, in the evening of the 7th, and I may be just wired enough to be up at 2 o'clock in the morning.
Okay.
If I don't, I'll be back. I'll be there on the 8th. I don't know. It's 7. It's 2 o'clock in the morning on the 7th. Oh, I won't, because that'd be the day I'll be in the. No, that's not going to happen. I'll see you all on the 8th.
But it'll be it'll be up all week for all of our viewers, and we hope you can check it out. I think you'll actually hear some of the most recent music written for our instrument by someone like Jennifer Higdon and Augusta Reed Thomas, but then you have one of the earliest saxophone quartets demonstrated on the program by an American composer named Carol Florio, which was a pseudonym for a composer named William Robjohn. And but it's a beautiful quartet from 1879. So you actually hear right out of the gate, you hear this really exciting fanfare type work from Augusta Reed Thomas, and it goes immediately to one of our oldest pieces. And most of the pieces are being performed by memory, and all of these students are using these videos for competitions and chamber music, online chamber music festivals down the road. So I'm so proud of them, and they sound incredible, and I can't wait for everyone to check them out.
What a wonderful conversation. It's great to meet you. It's amazing what you're doing. I've only known you from a distance and about you, and I'm just so pleased that we could really get this project on its feet at such a high and focused level. And my hat off, my admiration. I look forward to being in Ann Arbor sometime anon, and beers on me.
Absolutely. I will eagerly await that day that I get to see you in person and tell you more about all my favorite recordings of yours. So.
Then you can buy the beer.
Okay, I'll do that.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. We splashed over a little bit in time, but that's a nice thing about IDAGIO. They give me a little bit of freeway, and when it's this interesting and this important, I think it's time well spent. Thank you for joining us. I see you next week. I never tell you who the next guest is because sometimes I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
Actually, I don't want to jinx it. We have a nice lineup of people, but things getting moved. Never mind. It doesn't matter. I will see you next Thursday. Thank you very much for joining us. IDAGIO.com, where classical music happens. Thank you, Tim McAllister. All the best. Thank you for being here. And don't miss December 7th. The sax quartet is, you won't believe it.